Hello everyone, welcome to Iterators.com. This is Surya Prakash, your Python trainer. This video is about iterators and generators in Python. In this video, we are going to discuss what are iterators and what are generators. We also discuss how to work with iterators and generators. Now getting into the course. In simple terms, iterator is a Python object which can be iterated, and these iterator objects would return only one element from the sequence each time we call that iterator. The iterators would consist of two methods, especially one is iter and the other one is the next. Iter method is the one which would make an object iterable, and the next method is used to call the element or the next element from a sequence. Collectively, the iter and the next method are called as the iter protocol. In Python programming language, an iterator is an object which implements the iterator protocol. So when we pass an object like a list or a string to the iter function, so the iter method would make that particular object as a iterable object, and then we could call the next function or the next method on that particular object to retrieve the elements one by one from that particular iterator. So we'll now see the advantages of the iterator. Iterator helps us to write a cleaner piece of code, and iterators can also are very flexible to work with infinite sequences. And the most important one is that iterators would save the resources. That is, whenever we use the for loop, so when we call a for loop on particular sequence, so at that when we use the for loop, it would return all the data set, or we can say the entire output string onto the console at a time. But in case of iterators, so for each call we need to make a particular call to get element from that particular sequence. So for each iteration it would return only one element by saving the memory and other resources, by improving the efficiency. So now let's see an example in order to understand how iterators can be implemented in programs. So let's see, we have an list over here which is named as a list. So it is having an elements 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So we are calling the for loop in order to retrieve the elements from this particular list. So for x in that particular a list would return us the elements of that particular list. So when we execute this particular function, it would return us all the elements onto the console or onto the output terminal at a time. So if we use the iterators over this, so let's see that how to initiate the iterators. So in order, let's say that itr is my iterator object. So in order to invoke an object, iterator object, we use a function called iter function. So this would take the name of the element which we are trying to pass, the name of the object. So we are passing a list. So I would like to convert this a list into an iterator. So this iter function would take a list and it would be converting this particular a list into an iter object. So let's try to print this particular itr. So when we execute this particular program, this print itr would say that we have created a list iterator at some particular location. So here the iter function would internally call the item method in order to make this particular variable, that is a list, into a iterable object. So whenever we would like to retrieve the particular values of this particular elements of this particular list, then we can use the next method in order to, this particular method would retrieve the elements of that particular list. So on that particular object, let's say that itr is our iterable object. On this particular object, we need to call next method in order to receive the elements of that particular thing. So let's just add a couple of statements so that we could retrieve the three elements. So when we execute this particular piece of code, so here we can see that it is now retrieving the first, second and the third element of that particular list. So you can see that 1, 2, 3. So it will keep a track of the things of the which element it has been previously displayed onto the screen. And whenever we again call this particular method, or we can say whenever we issue the iterator statement, so it would now display as the next statement. So here in this case we'll get 1, 2, 3, and by the newly added statement it will return us with 4. So when we execute this, when we just run this program, so we are getting 4. So in this particular list we have 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 5. So till this we don't face any error, so we can just freely get the elements of that particular list. when we try to get the element which is beyond the set, or the elements which are beyond the value of that particular list. So at this particular time it would return as an state error stating that stop iteration error. So here in this list we have only the elements 1, 2, 3, and 4 and 5. There are 5 elements. So for the first 5 iterations it would work perfectly. So these 5 iterations would doesn't throw any error. But when we are going for the 6th iteration, or when we are calling the next statement for the 6th iteration, there is no element, or the length of the list is only 5. So we are trying to get the object which is beyond the length. So at this particular time it would give an error saying that stop iteration. So this is a basic example to understand what are iterators, and how to call or retrieve the elements of iterators. So we'll now see another example at the class level how to implement an iterator. So here we are writing a similar function which is just similar to the xRange function. So I'm writing a function, I'm writing a class called arange. So this would do perform the same things like which we do in using the xRange. So in this particular class we have mainly two methods. One is iter method and the other is the next method. So iter method is used in order to create that particular object on, that is the iterator object, and the next is used in order to move towards the elements, or in order to retrieve the element one by one using the next method. So when we want to just initiate this, so we need to create object one. I'm just trying to create an object on this particular class. So arrange, so this would take one element. So I would like to create arrange for 5. So it would return us with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 4 till 4 it would return. So when this would create the object 1. So in order to just we'll try to print the object 1. So when we execute this particular piece of code, it would show us that a main arrange instance at, so this particular instance has been created. So whenever you want to call the particular values, or whenever you want to try to retrieve this particular element, so on this particular object we just call the next function. So whenever we call the next function, this would retrieve the elements of this particular iterator object. So for the first time, it would return us with 0. So when we execute this particular piece of code, this print statement would return us 0, which is the first element in our X range, or we can say that A range. So whenever I call it in the next time, it would return us 0 and 1. So it would return as 0 and 1 as shown. So as similar as we are giving a range of 5, so it would return as a 5 element. So I'm just trying to execute this particular piece of code. So here we are just getting the function is similar to the X range. So this is just a similar implementation of X range function. So we are just retrieving 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So whenever we try to call this particular object again, it would throw us an error stating that stop iteration. So we are raising the exception. Here we are raising the exception using the code. So this is the basic information on how we can work with iterators. And we have generators. Generators are used to simplify the creation of iteration. A generator can be called as a special routine that can be used to control the iteration behavior of a loop. Generators are very similar to the functions of returning an array. A generator takes the parameters and a generator can be called, and it generates a sequence of numbers. But unlike functions which return a whole array, a generator yields one value at a time. So this generators would require a very less memory. We can define generators by using the def keyword, that is def keyword, and we use yield keywords in order to generate the numbers or the elements. And there is no limitation on the usage of yield. We can use multiple yield keywords in our particular generator definition, and generators would return an iterator. So we'll now see an example in order to understand more about generators. So let's see, here we have a function which is defined using the def keyword. So that let's say that this is a generator function, which from which we are trying to get the squares of the numbers. So it would take the input of a number and it would return us with the square of the number. So if we pass 2, it would, this particular thing would return us 4. So 2 into 2, it would return us 4. So here we are just passing a list to this particular function. So let's say that's a generator function. So here we have a square which is a list in order to store our result, and we are running a for loop on this particular list, and we are just performing the operation of multiple operation on this, and we are just returning our result uh, using return squares. So squares is the one which is a list which is holding our result. So when we execute this particular list, it would return us the squares of the particular input list. The same we can change using the yield statement that is coming to the what we say generators. So when we use generators especially, so at this time we just need to add an yield statement over this particular thing. So whenever we use yield statement, yield is a keyword. So so when we execute this particular piece of code, it would return us a generator object stating that this particular generator object has been created at some instance location. So whenever you want to call the element, or whenever you want to read the element of that particular result function, so we just need to call the next. So whenever you are going to call this particular statement, so it would return us the element, the first element. So whenever you want to print the next element in this particular sequence, so we just need to give the next of result. So I would like to call it multiple times. So whenever we are going to call this particular multiple times, it is just retrieving the each element for each iteration call. So for the first time it is returning 1, and for next iteration it is returning the square of 2, and for the third iteration it is returning the square of 3. In similar it's going on. So in similar, whenever you try to call beyond the element beyond the length of the list, so it would return us with an error stating that stop iteration. So not only this, you can also just divert the output, or you can divert the output into a list by using the list keyword. So instead of next, whenever you use the list statement, your complete output would be stored into a list, and the list would be presented onto the screen. But this is not the true essence behind using the generators. This is just simple using like a normal list. So whenever you want to use the efficiency parameter, so at that time it's better to use the next keyword in order to call each statement at a time and use it in your programs. Thank you for watching our video. Stay tuned for more information.